The morning mist clung to the Clearwater River like a shroud over grief itself, and Brantley Hollis rode through it with the mechanical precision of a man whose soul had been carved hollow. His chestnut mare, Copper, knew the path by heart down the worn cattle trail, past the lightning split oak, through the meadow where wildflowers danced in mockery of joy he could no longer feel. For 8 months, this pilgrimage had been their routine, man and horse bound by ritual and sorrow. Brantley dismounted at the river's edge where the water ran shallow over smooth stones, where cattails whispered secrets to the dawn. This was the place where his world had shattered, where the current had claimed what mattered most. He pulled off his weathered Stetson and stood in silence, his calloused hands trembling as they gripped the brim. The morning sun painted the water gold, but all he saw was darkness. "Morning, Violet," he whispered to the flowing water, his voice hoarse with unshed tears. "Morning, little sage." His wife and infant son had been crossing this very spot when the flash flood came, a wall of muddy death that had turned their Sunday picnic into his lifetime of torment. The search teams had found Violet's body 3 days later, but baby Sage had simply vanished, as if the river had swallowed him whole and refused to give him back. Copper stood patient as stone while Brantley knelt by the water's edge, his weathered hands trailing in the current. Sometimes he imagined he could feel them, their Violet's gentle touch, Sage's tiny fingers. The rational part of his mind knew it was madness, but madness had become his closest companion in the months since the tragedy. The mare suddenly lifted her head, ears pricked forward toward something downstream. She took a few steps into the shallows, her hooves clicking against the stones with unusual purpose. Brantley barely noticed, lost in his daily communion with ghosts. "Easy, girl," he murmured absently when Copper waded deeper, her powerful chest cutting through the knee-deep water. She'd never done this before, never shown interest in anything beyond their solemn ritual, but today something was different. Something was calling to her. The horse moved with deliberate intention, picking her way carefully through the rocky stream. Brantley watched with growing curiosity as she approached a cluster of river birches whose roots created small eddies in the current. Copper lowered her great head and gently lifted something from the water, with her teeth, something small and pale that dripped river water like tears. When she returned to shore and dropped her discovery at his feet, Brantley's world tilted on its axis. There, on the muddy bank, lay a pair of tiny leather shoes, handcrafted with the kind of loving detail that spoke of a parent's devotion. They were impossibly small, sized for a baby who had barely begun to walk. His hands shook as he picked them up, turning them over in the morning light. They were well made but weathered, as if they'd been lost for a very long time. The leather was soft with age and river water, but the craftsmanship was exquisite, each stitch placed with care, each curve designed for tiny, precious feet. "Where did you find these?" he whispered to Copper, but the mare only nuzzled his shoulder with unusual gentleness, as if she understood the weight of what she'd retrieved. The next morning brought no peace to Brantley's restless mind. The baby shoes sat on his kitchen table like an accusation, their presence both comforting and deeply unsettling. He'd barely slept, his dreams filled with questions that had no answers. Who had made such beautiful shoes? What child had worn them? And why had Copper been drawn to that particular spot in the river? Despite his exhaustion, he found himself riding to the river again, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name. Copper seemed equally eager, stepping lively down the familiar trail, with an energy he hadn't seen in months. When they reached the water's edge, the mare immediately waded back to the same cluster of birches, her behavior deliberate and purposeful. This time, she emerged with something even more mysterious, a small wooden rattle, its paint faded but still showing traces of cheerful yellow and red. The craftsmanship was as meticulous as the shoes, hand-carved with tiny birds and flowers dancing around its surface. A piece of faded ribbon was tied through a hole at one end, suggesting it had once been attached to something, perhaps a crib or a child's clothing. Brantley's throat tightened as he examined the toy. Someone had poured love into its creation, had spent hours carving each delicate detail for a child who would shake it with delight. The thought of his own son, who would never play with rattles or learn to walk in tiny leather shoes, sent a familiar spike of grief through his chest. But alongside the sorrow came something new: curiosity. These weren't random objects lost by careless picnickers. They spoke of a different era, when such things were made by hand with painstaking care. The leather of the shoes showed the kind of aging that took decades, not months. The rattles wood had the deep patina that only came with considerable time. What are you trying to tell me, girl?" he asked Copper, but she only stood quietly, her dark eyes reflecting a wisdom he couldn't fathom. That afternoon, Brantley drove into Millbrook Ridge, the nearest town, carrying the shoes and rattle in a paper bag. The local library was a small brick building that smelled of old books and dust, but its elderly librarian, Mrs. Cordelia Thorne, had lived in the county her entire 83 years and knew every family story worth telling. She examined the items with the careful attention of someone who understood the weight of history. Her gnarled fingers traced the stitching on the shoes, turned the rattle over to examine its construction. When she looked up, her pale blue eyes held a glimmer of recognition. "These are very old, Brantley," she said softly. "The workmanship. I've seen similar pieces in the County Historical Society." This style of shoe was popular in the 1890s, maybe early 1900s. And this rattle, the carving technique, is distinctly Germanic, the kind brought over by the immigrant families who settled along the Clearwater. 1890s, Brantley's voice cracked slightly. "That's impossible. They can't have been in the river for over a century." Mrs. Thorne's expression grew thoughtful, almost troubled. "There are stories," she said carefully, "about that stretch of the river. Old stories that most folks have forgotten or choose not to believe. Would you like to hear them?" Brantley nodded, though part of him dreaded what she might tell him. "The Zimmerman family settled along the Clearwater in 1887, she began, her voice taking on the cadence of a well-worn tale. "Heinrich and Greta, with their infant son, Klaus, they built a small cabin upstream from where your family used to picnic. The river was different then, wilder, more unpredictable." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "They say little Klaus was playing by the water's edge one spring morning when the river claimed him. Just like," she caught herself, her eyes filling with compassion. "The parents searched for weeks, but the boy was never found. Greta made those shoes for his first birthday, and Heinrich carved that rattle while she was pregnant. They were found in the cabin after the family moved away, too grief-stricken to stay." The library seemed to grow colder as she spoke. Brantley felt the hair on his arms stand up, though he couldn't say why. "But that's not the strangest part of the story," Mrs. Thorne continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Thorne leaned forward, her weathered hands clasped tightly together. "The strangest part," she continued, "is that Klaus Zimmerman wasn't the last child the Clearwater claimed. Over the decades, there have been others, always infants or toddlers, always in that same stretch of river. The McBride baby in 1923, little Josephine Hartwell in 1941, the Kowalski twins in 1967. Brantley's blood ran cold. He thought of his own sweet Sage, swept away by the same merciless current that had claimed these other children across more than a century. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that river has seen too much sorrow," the librarian replied, her voice heavy with accumulated grief. "And sometimes, when grief runs that deep, it leaves impressions, echoes that don't fade with time." The next morning, Brantley approached the river with new eyes. The mist seemed thicker, more purposeful, and Copper's behavior had grown even more unusual. She paced the shoreline, nickering softly as if calling to something only she could perceive. When she finally entered the water, she moved with the careful reverence of someone approaching a shrine. This time, she brought back a small silver locket, tarnished black with age. Inside, Brantley found a tintype photograph of a young woman holding an infant, their faces serious in the formal style of the era, but their eyes bright with love. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Greta and Klaus, 1888. His hands trembled as he stared at the image. The woman's face held an expression he recognized intimately: the fierce, protective love of a mother for her child. It was the same look he'd seen in Violet's eyes when she held baby Sage, the same expression that haunted his dreams, but it was the child who truly stole his breath. Klaus Zimmerman couldn't have been more than 6 months old when the photograph was taken. but his face held an otherworldly serenity that seemed to transcend time itself. His tiny hand rested against his mother's chest, and his dark eyes seemed to look directly at Brantley across the gulf of more than a century. "Why are you showing me this?" he whispered to Copper. But the mare had already turned back toward the river, her attention fixed on something in the deeper water near the far bank. Over the following days, the pattern continued. Each morning brought a new discovery: a child's pewter spoon engraved with the initials JH, a faded cloth doll missing one button eye, a christening gown so delicate it seemed woven from moonlight and memory. Each item told a story of love and loss, of parents who had poured their hopes into objects meant to comfort and delight their children. Brantley began researching the names and initials, matching them to the stories Mrs. Thorne had shared. The spoon had belonged to Josephine Hartwell, the daughter of a traveling preacher who had drowned while her family was camped by the river in 1941. The doll had been clutched in the arms of little Anastasia Kowalski when the flash flood took her and her twin brother in 1967. With each discovery, Brantley felt a strange kinship growing not just with the lost children, but with their parents. He began to understand that his grief, overwhelming as it felt, was part of a larger tapestry of sorrow that stretched back through generations. The river hadn't just taken his son. It had been claiming children for over a century, leaving behind a wake of broken parents and shattered dreams. But why was Copper finding these things now? And why was she finding them at all? Horses weren't known for their archaeological instincts, yet his mare seemed drawn to these artifacts with supernatural precision. Each morning, she would wade into the water with the confidence of someone following a map only she could read. On the seventh day, Copper's behavior changed dramatically. Instead of immediately entering the water, she stood at the river's edge and whinnied a long, mournful sound that seemed to echo across both the water and the years. The sound raised goosebumps on Brantley's arms and made him feel as though he was standing at the threshold of something vast and incomprehensible. When she finally entered the water, she moved more slowly than before, her steps measured and deliberate. She stopped in the deepest part of the channel, where the current ran strongest, and stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. Then, with infinite gentleness, she lowered her head and lifted something from the riverbed that made Brantley's heart stop. It was a baby's blanket, handwear upon in soft blue wool, with tiny white stars scattered across its surface like hopes cast into the night sky. The blanket trembled in Brantley's hands like a living thing, its wool still soft despite what must have been decades underwater. But as he examined it more closely, his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't an antique like the other items Copper had retrieved. The yarn was too bright, the pattern too familiar. With growing disbelief, he traced the delicate border of tiny lambs that danced around the blanket's edge. This was Sage's blanket, the one Violet had wear upon during the long winter nights before their son was born, her needles clicking in rhythm with the crackling fire while she hummed lullabies to her unborn child, the one that had been wrapped around their baby boy when the floodwaters swept him away 8 months ago. How he whispered, his voice breaking. How is this possible? Copper stood in the shallows, water dripping from her legs, watching him with those dark, knowing eyes. For the first time since the tragedy, Brantley felt something crack open inside his chest, not breaking, but opening, like a door that had been sealed tight against hope finally creaking ajar. He pressed the blanket to his face and breathed in, deeply, beneath the mineral scent of river water. He caught the faintest trace of the lavender soap Violet had used, the sweet milk and powder smell that had clung to everything in their baby's nursery. It was impossible, but it was real as the pain that had been his constant companion, as real as the love that had never died despite his son's absence. That night, Brantley spread all the items across his kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle he was only beginning to understand. The baby shoes, the rattle, the locket, the spoon, the doll, the christening gown, and now Sage's blanket, somehow returned from whatever depths had claimed it. Each object seemed to glow with its own inner light in the lamplight, as if they were charged with the love of the parents who had once cherished them. He found himself talking to them as if the children they'd belonged to could hear him. "Klaus," he said, touching the little leather shoes, Your mama made these for you. She wanted your first steps to be perfect. He picked up the silver rattle. And your papa carved this while he waited for you to be born. He probably tested it 100 times to make sure it would make just the right sound to make you smile. As he spoke, something extraordinary happened. The loneliness that had been his constant companion began to recede, replaced by a sense of connection that transcended time and death. These weren't just artifacts of tragedy. They were tokens of love that had somehow survived the worst thing imaginable. They were proof that the bond between parent and child was stronger than death, deeper than rivers, more enduring than grief itself. The next morning brought an unusually warm day for late autumn, and the river ran clearer than Brantley had ever seen it. Copper seemed different to calmer, more purposeful, as if she had completed some cosmic task and was now waiting for the next phase to begin. She led him to a different spot along the bank, a gentle curve where the water eddied in lazy circles. Around a fallen log. Here, she didn't enter the water at all. Instead, she stood perfectly still and stared at something on the opposite shore, something Brantley couldn't see but that seemed to hold her complete attention. Her ears were pricked forward, and she nickered softly, the way she used to greet friendly horses in neighboring pastures. Following her gaze, Brantley felt his heart begin to race. At first, he saw nothing but morning mist rising from the water and the golden autumn foliage on the far bank. But as he watched, the mist seemed to take shape, not quite solid, but not entirely insubstantial either. Figures began to emerge from the ethereal white, translucent as dreams but unmistakably human. A woman in old-fashioned dress knelt by the water's edge, her arms outstretched as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. Beside her stood a man in rough work clothes, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Both of them gazed across the water with expressions of infinite longing and love. Greta and Heinrich Zimmermann, Brantley realized with a certainty that defied logic, still searching for their lost son after more than a century, still hoping against hope that love could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. But they weren't alone. As his eyes adjusted to the strange, shifting light, Brantley saw other figures, dozens of them, stretching along the far shore like a congregation of grief. Parents from across the decades, united in their loss, bound together by the terrible privilege of loving a child the river had claimed. And then, emerging from the mist like an answer to every prayer he'd never dared to speak, Brantley saw her. Violet stood among the other grieving parents, but she was different, more solid, more present, as if the recent nature of her loss had not yet allowed her to fade completely into whatever realm claimed the others. She wore the blue dress she'd been buried in, but it seemed to flow and shift like water itself, and her dark hair moved as if touched by a breeze that existed between worlds. In her arms, she held a child. Brantley's knees nearly buckled as he recognized the perfect curve of his son's cheek, the dark eyes that were so like Violet's, the tiny hands that had once wrapped around his finger with surprising strength. Sage looked exactly as he had in life, 8 months old, chubby and content, his face lit with the serene smile that had been his most endearing trait. "Violet," Brantley whispered, his voice carrying across the water like a prayer. "Oh God, Violet, is that really you?" She looked up at the sound of her name, and their eyes met across the river that had both separated and somehow united them. Her smile was radiant with a joy that transcended earthly understanding, and she lifted one hand in a gesture that was both greeting and blessing. Sage gurgled happily in her arms, his tiny fist reaching toward his father with the same trust he'd shown in life. Round them, the other parents began to stir. Greta Zimmermann rose from her eternal vigil and approached Violet, her arms extended in welcome. The two women embraced with the instant understanding of shared experience, and Greta reached out to stroke Sage's cheek with ghostly fingers. Other figures pressed closer, a young couple who could only be the Kowalski parents, an elderly woman who might have been Josephine Hartwell's mother, dozens of others whose faces held the universal expression of parental love mixed with loss. But it was a small figure that emerged from the group that made Brantley's heart nearly stop beating. A toddler with golden curls and eyes like starlight toddled toward Violet and Sage with the unsteady but determined gait of a child just learning to walk. On his feet were the tiny leather shoes Copper had found, and in his hand he clutched the silver rattle that had been his father's gift, Klaus Zimmermann. Brantley realized still the baby he'd been when the river claimed him, but somehow, aged into the toddler he might have become. He reached up to touch Sage's hand, and the two children, separated by more than a century, but united in their shared fate, smiled at each other with the innocent joy that only children possess. As Brantley watched in wonder, more children appeared. Josephine Hartwell skipped forward, her pewter spoon glinting in the ethereal light. The Kowalski twins ran hand in hand, their laughter like silver bells echoing across the water. Anastasia clutched her one-eyed doll while her brothers spun in circles, both of them giggling with delight. The river's lost children had found each other, and in finding each other, they had found peace. Copper whinnied softly beside him, and Brantley understood that his faithful mare had been instrumental in bringing about this reunion. Somehow, her daily trips to the river had awakened something, had stirred the boundary between worlds, until the love that bound these families together could manifest in this extraordinary gathering. "Thank you," he called to Violet, his voice strong despite the tears streaming down his face. "Thank you for taking care of him. Thank you for loving him." Violet's response came not as words, but as a feeling that flooded his heart: love without condition, forgiveness without reservation, understanding that transcended the need for explanation. She held Sage up so Brantley could see him clearly, and their son reached out with both arms toward his father, his face bright with recognition and joy. In that moment, Brantley understood that his son was not lost, had never been lost. Sage was exactly where he needed to be, surrounded by love, protected by other parents who understood the precious nature of childhood, playing with children who would never judge him. For the circumstances of his death, the river hadn't stolen him, it had delivered him to a community of souls who would cherish him for eternity. The gathering on the far shore began to shift and move, and Brantley sensed that this moment of connection was drawing to a close. But Violet raised her hand once more, and this time her voice reached him across the water, clear as a bell and warm as summer sunshine. "He's safe, my love. We're all safe. The river couldn't take what matters most, it could only carry us home." As the ghostly gathering began to fade, Brantley felt a pull unlike anything he'd ever experienced, a magnetic draw toward the water that seemed to emanate from the very core of his being. He took a step forward, then another, until his boots touched the river's edge. Copper nickered nervously beside him, but didn't try to stop him. The water looked different now, not like the muddy, dangerous current that had haunted his nightmares, but like liquid starlight, inviting and warm. He could see Violet more clearly than before, could make out every beloved detail of her face, every curve of Sage's cherubic features. They were so close now, just a few yards of water separating him from everything he'd lost. "Come to us," Violet whispered, her voice carrying impossible distances. "The water is gentle here. Brantley, it won't hurt you. You can be with us forever." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Brantley stood balanced on the knife's edge. Between worlds, how easy it would be to take that final step, to let the river carry him to where his heart already resided. No more lonely mornings, no more empty house echoing with memories, no more grinding weight of grief that made each breath an effort. He began to lift his foot, ready to step into that inviting current, when Copper's urgent whinny cut through the ethereal peace. The mare pushed against him with surprising force, her warm body solid and real against his side. The contact jarred him back to awareness of the physical world, the cold morning air, the solid ground beneath his feet, the life that still flowed through his veins. "Wait," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But Violet heard him, and her expression changed from invitation to understanding. "You're not ready," she said, and her tone held no disappointment, only love. "There's still work for you to do on that side of the river." As if her words had broken a spell, other voices began to join hers. Heinrich Zimmermann stepped forward, his ghostly hand raised in a gesture of both blessing and warning. "The living need you," he said, his German accent still detectable across the centuries. "There are others who will stand where you stand now, and they will need someone who understands." Mrs. Kowalski nodded, her twin boys clinging to her skirts. The grief is so heavy when it's fresh. She added, but you've learned something. We wish we'd known that love doesn't end with death. Share that knowledge. Help them find peace before their time comes to cross over. Brantley looked around at all the faces, parents and children united in understanding that transcended earthly sorrow. They weren't asking him to forget, weren't suggesting he stop grieving. They were asking him to transform his grief into something that could heal others. How? He asked. How do I help them when I can barely help myself? Violet shifted Sage to her hip and pointed toward the collection of objects on the riverbank. All the items Copper had retrieved over the past week. Those aren't just memories, she said. They're proof that love survives, that connections endure, that parents and children are never truly separated. Show them what you've learned. Tell them what you've seen. As if responding to her words, the objects began to glow with soft, warm light, not the harsh illumination of electricity, but the gentle radiance of love made manifest. They pulsed in rhythm with Brantley's heartbeat, as if they were alive with the emotions that had created them. Every parent who loses a child will find their way to places like this, Violet continued. Rivers, lakes, oceans, anywhere water runs. The boundary grows thin. Some will try to follow their children too soon, before they've shared what they've learned, before they've helped others find hope. Sage babbled happily in his mother's arms, reaching out toward his father one more time. As Brantley watched, other children gathered around Klaus with his leather shoes and silver rattle, Josephine with her pewter spoon, the Kowalski twins with their shared joy, Anastasia with her beloved doll. They formed a circle round Violet and Sage, their young faces bright with purpose. We'll wait for you, Klaus said, his voice carrying the wisdom of ages despite his toddler's appearance. All of us will wait. But first, help our parents find peace. Help them understand that we're not lost, we're just playing in a different place until they can join us. The vision began to fade as the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist that had made this miraculous encounter possible. But before they disappeared entirely, Violet blew him a kiss that he felt land softly on his cheek, warm as her lips had been in life. I love you, Brantley Hollis, she said. We both love you. And we'll love you through all the years until you come home to us. As the last wisps of mist cleared, Brantley found himself alone on the riverbank with Copper and the glowing collection of artifacts. The water looked ordinary again, just a river running its eternal course toward the sea. But everything had changed. The crushing weight of despair that had been his constant companion had lifted, replaced by something he hadn't felt in 8 months, purpose. 6 months later, Brantley Hollis had become a different kind of legend. Along the Clearwater River, word had spread through the county about the cowboy who'd lost everything to the river, but found a way to help others navigate their own grief. They came to him from hundreds of miles away, parents whose children had drowned, families torn apart by sudden loss, anyone who needed to understand that love transcends death. He'd moved the collection of artifacts to a special room in his house, where they were displayed with reverence and care. Each object was accompanied by the story of the child who'd owned it, written in Brantley's careful hand. Visitors would sit quietly among these tokens of enduring love, finding comfort in the knowledge that their own loss was part of a larger tapestry of human experience. Mrs. Cordelia Thorne had helped him research and document the stories, creating a historical record that honored both the lost children and their grieving parents. The county had designated the stretch of river as a memorial site, with a beautiful stone marker that read, "In memory of all the children claimed by these waters, and in honor of the love that never dies." But Brantley's real work happened on the quiet mornings when desperate parents found their way to the riverbank, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had once brought him there. They came with flowers, with tears, with hearts so broken they couldn't imagine healing. And Brantley would be there, with Copper at his side, ready to share what he'd learned. The water didn't take them from us, he would tell them gently, his weathered hands holding artifacts that glowed with mysterious warmth. It carried them to where they needed to be. And someday, when our work here is finished, we'll cross that same water to join them. Some visitors were skeptical at first, dismissing his stories as the delusions of a grief-stricken man. But then, they would see the artifacts glow in response to their touch. or catch glimpses of movement in the morning mist, or feel the unmistakable presence of love that permeated the memorial site. Skepticism would give way to wonder, and wonder would bloom into healing. Copper had become as much a part of the healing process as Brantley himself. The old mare seemed to sense which visitors needed her attention most, approaching them with the same gentle wisdom she'd shown when retrieving the artifacts. Children were especially drawn to her, and she would stand patiently while they stroked her neck and whispered their fears and sorrows into her understanding ear. On quiet days, when no visitors came, Brantley and Copper would still make their morning pilgrimage to the river, but now it was a celebration rather than a vigilant time to commune with the children, who played in the space between worlds, and to receive guidance for helping the next grieving parent who would seek them out. The artifacts no longer appeared randomly in the water. Their purpose had been served, their message delivered. But sometimes, on mornings when the mist was particularly thick, Brantley would catch glimpses of the eternal gathering on the far shore. Violet would wave, Sage would reach out with chubby arms, and the other children would dance and play in their timeless joy. Soon, Violet would mouth across the water, and Brantley would nod in understanding. Not yet. There was still work to do, still hearts to heal, still hope to kindle in the darkness of fresh grief. But someday, when the last desperate parent had found peace, when the final story had been told, when his purpose on this side of the river was complete, he would take that step into the welcoming current. On this particular morning, as golden light painted the water and Copper grazed peacefully nearby, Brantley felt a profound sense of completeness. He'd transformed his tragedy into triumph, his grief into grace, his loss into a legacy of love that would endure long after he crossed over to join his family. A young couple appeared on the path. Behind him, their faces etched with fresh sorrow, their arms empty of the child they'd come seeking. Brantley smiled and rose to meet them, knowing that their journey toward healing was just beginning, and that he had been given the privilege of walking alongside them. Until they found their own peace, the river flowed on, carrying away sorrow and bringing back hope, connecting the living and the dead in its eternal embrace. And on both sides of its banks, love endured deeper than water, stronger than death, infinite as the morning mist that danced between two worlds, promising that every ending was also a beginning, every goodbye merely a whispered until we meet again. In the gentle current, the voices of children laughed and played, reminding anyone who cared to listen that some things are too precious to ever truly lose, too beautiful to ever completely die, too powerful to be contained by something as simple as the boundary between life and whatever comes after. The cowboy no longer rode to the river daily in grief. Now he came as a guardian, a guide, a living bridge between heartbreak and hope, proof that even the deepest waters could not drown the love between a parent and child, and that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from forgetting our losses, but from helping others transform theirs into something sacred.